The clock had just struck 10 p.m., and the dim lights inside the Starbucks barely cut through the thick darkness that had settled over the streets of San Diego. Amanda, a young barista with long dark hair tied up in a messy bun, wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that evening. Her coworker had gone to the back to restock, leaving her alone in the quiet, empty cafe. The night shift was usually uneventful, just a few late-night stragglers looking for a caffeine fix before heading home. But tonight felt different. An unsettling stillness hung in the air, a silence so deep it felt almost oppressive. Amanda had tried to brush off the strange feeling in her gut, but as the minutes ticked by, a creeping dread began to gnaw at her. Across the room, a man sat alone in the corner, shrouded in shadows. He had been there for hours, sitting so still he could have been mistaken for a statue. He hadn't ordered anything since he first came in, a single cup of black coffee that now sat cold and untouched on the table in front of him. His eyes, however, were what made Amanda's skin crawl. He was staring at her, his gaze unblinking, as if he could see right through her. Amanda tried to ignore him, focusing instead on cleaning up and closing down. She told herself he was probably harmless, just another lonely soul with nowhere else to go. But the intensity of his stare was unnerving. Every time she glanced up, his eyes were locked on hers, dark and unyielding, a predatory gaze that made her heart race with fear. Her coworker returned, breaking the tense silence, and together they continued their closing routine. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Amanda could feel the man's eyes following her every move, tracking her like a shadow. She whispered to her coworker, "Have you noticed that guy in the corner? He's been staring at me all night." Her coworker glanced over, nodding slightly. "Yeah, he's been here a while. It's kinda creepy. Want me to ask him to leave?" Amanda hesitated, then shook her head. "No, it's fine. He'll probably leave when we close up." But the man didn't move. Even as they began to close down the cafe, shutting off the lights and locking the doors, he remained seated, his gaze never wavering. Amanda could feel her skin prickling with unease. Something about him wasn't right. As the clock inched closer to closing time, the sense of dread intensified. Amanda's coworker had gone to the back to finish some last-minute tasks, leaving her alone with the man once again. She took a deep breath and decided to confront him. Maybe if she told him they were closing, he would finally leave. She walked over to the door, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We're about to close. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man didn't respond. He just continued to stare at her with those cold, empty eyes. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as she tried again, louder this time. "Sir, we're closed. You need to leave now." Suddenly, without warning, the man stood up. His movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. He walked over to the door and pressed his face against the glass, his eyes never leaving hers. Amanda froze, her breath catching in her throat. His face was twisted into a grotesque grin, his teeth bared in a sinister smile. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he began pounding on the glass with his fists. The sound was deafening, a thunderous crash that reverberated through the empty cafe. Amanda stumbled back, her heart racing with terror. The man's expression grew more manic with each blow, his eyes wild with a frenzied intensity. "Amanda!" her coworker shouted from the back. "What's going on?" She couldn't find her voice. Fear had seized her throat, choking off her words. She backed away from the door, her eyes locked on the man's twisted face. He was shouting now, his voice a guttural roar that sent chills down her spine. But his words were incoherent, a jumbled mess of sounds that made no sense. Her coworker rushed to her side, grabbing her arm. "We need to call the police. Now." They ran to the back room, slamming the door behind them. Amanda's hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial the number. She could still hear the man's fists pounding against the glass, the sound growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. When the police finally arrived, the pounding stopped. Amanda and her coworker cautiously emerged from the back. their hearts still racing with fear. The officers searched the area, but the man was gone, vanished into the night as if he had never been there at all. Amanda described the man to the police, but they found no trace of him. No one matching his description was seen in the area, and the security footage from the cafe was inexplicably blurry and distorted, as if some unseen force had tampered with it. It wasn't until later that the police told them about the assaults. A man matching the description Amanda gave had been linked to several violent attacks in the neighborhood over the past few weeks. He had never been caught, his face always hidden in the shadows, his presence felt but never seen. Amanda knew she had been lucky that night. The memory of the man's twisted grin haunted her, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide in plain sight. She never worked the night shift again, unable to shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the shadowed corners of the world, he was still watching, waiting. On a cold, misty evening in Seattle, Karen walked into her usual Starbucks, the warm, inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee providing a welcome respite from the biting chill outside. She was a regular here, knew the baristas by name, and even had a favorite corner where she liked to sit and watch the world go by through the rain-speckled windows. But tonight, something felt different. The usual chatter seemed quieter, the lights dimmer, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. As she approached the counter, Karen noticed an unusual cup sitting on the edge. It was unlike any she had seen before, covered in strange, cryptic symbols that seemed almost hand-drawn. They snaked around the cup, forming a dizzying spiral that pulled her gaze in, the lines seeming to writhe and shift as if alive. "Hey, what's with this cup?" Karen asked the barista, a young man named Tom, who had worked there for years. Tom looked puzzled. "I have no idea. That wasn't there a few minutes ago. We don't have cups like that here." Intrigued and a little unsettled, Karen decided to take the cup. She figured it was some sort of prank or a promotional gimmick she wasn't aware of. As she sipped her coffee, she couldn't shake the feeling that the symbols were watching her, their shapes crawling across the cup in her peripheral vision. She chalked it up to a trick of the light and the fatigue from a long day at work. When she finally left, the cup still in hand, the air outside felt colder, heavier, as if the darkness itself had thickened around her. She hurried home, eager to escape the creeping sense of unease that had settled over her. That night, as she prepared for bed, Karen placed the cup on her kitchen counter. She stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, the symbols still making her skin crawl. Then, shaking her head at her own foolishness, she turned off the lights and went to sleep. At around 2 a.m., Karen was jolted awake by a loud crash. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up, straining to hear in the silence that followed. There it was again, a soft rustling like paper sliding across the floor. She crept out of bed and slowly made her way to the kitchen, every step a hesitant echo in the darkened apartment. When she flicked on the light, she froze. The cup was on the floor, shattered into countless pieces despite having been placed safely in the center of the counter. She stared at the shards, her mind racing. It must have been the cat, she thought, though she didn't have a cat, and her apartment door was locked from the inside. As she bent down to pick up the pieces, Karen noticed something that made her blood run cold. Among the shattered remains, a new cup sat upright, pristine and untouched, right in the center of the chaos. It was identical to the first, the same dark symbols twisting and turning around its surface, almost glowing under the harsh kitchen light. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch it, half expecting it to burn her skin. But it was just a cup, cool to the touch, yet somehow wrong. The air seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as if charged with static. She grabbed the cup and threw it into the trash, slamming the lid shut. Breathing heavily, she told herself it was just her imagination, that she was tired and jumpy from the noise. But as she turned to leave the kitchen, the overhead lights flickered, casting strange, jittering shadows that seemed to stretch toward her, reaching out with long, spindly fingers. Karen didn't sleep well that night. Her dreams were plagued by visions of swirling black shapes and whispers in a language she couldn't understand. When she woke up the next morning, she felt a dull ache behind her eyes, as if she hadn't slept at all. She went to the kitchen to make coffee, hoping the familiar routine would calm her nerves. But when she opened the trash can, her heart stopped. The cup was back on the counter, spotless and whole, the symbols more pronounced than before, almost pulsating with a dark energy. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away, the room spinning around her. How was this possible? She had thrown it away, she was sure of it. She could feel her sanity slipping, the edges of her reality fraying like a threadbare curtain. Desperate, Karen grabbed the cup and rushed out of her apartment. She drove to the nearest park, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the dewy grass. She found a secluded spot by a cluster of trees and dug a small hole with her hands, her fingers numb from the cold and the damp earth. She buried the cup there, covering it with dirt and leaves, her heart racing as if she were being watched. When she returned home, she felt a small sense of relief, as if she had finally rid herself of the strange, cursed object. She spent the rest of the day trying to forget, to push the fear and the confusion out of her mind. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard it, the soft rustling again, followed by the unmistakable sound of ceramic sliding across the countertop. Her blood turned to ice as she forced herself to get up, her body moving as if in a nightmare, heavy and slow. The kitchen was dark, the shadows deeper than before, as if they had a life of their own. She flicked on the light, and there it was. The cup sat in the middle of the counter, dirt still clinging to its sides, the symbols almost vibrating with a malicious energy. Tears welled up in Karen's eyes as she backed away, her mind reeling with terror and disbelief. She couldn't escape it. The cup was a part of her now, bound to her in some dark, inexplicable way. She could feel it in her bones, in the marrow of her soul, a cold, creeping dread that settled in her chest like a stone. From that night on, strange things began happening in her apartment. Shadows moved on their own, whispers filled the air, and the temperature would drop suddenly, causing her breath to fog in the middle of summer. She could feel something watching her, its presence a constant weight on her mind. Desperate, she reached out to the baristas at Starbucks, asking if they knew anything about the cup, if anyone else had experienced anything similar. But they all denied ever seeing such a cup, and their eyes would shift away, uncomfortable, as if they could sense the darkness that had latched onto her. Karen stopped going to that Starbucks. She stopped going out at all. She became a prisoner in her own home, haunted by the cup that refused to leave her. And every night she would hear it, the soft, insidious rustling of ceramic against wood, a reminder that it was still there, waiting for her. Months passed, and the darkness only grew stronger. Karen's friends stopped calling, her family stopped visiting. She was alone, consumed by the fear and the madness that had taken root in her mind. The cup sat on her counter, always there, always watching, its symbols now burned into her vision even when she closed her eyes. One day, Karen vanished. Her apartment was found empty, the doors locked from the inside. The only thing left behind was that cup, sitting on the counter, the symbols on its surface still writhing as if alive, waiting for the next person to pick it up and become its new host. To this day, no one knows what happened to Karen, but some say her spirit lingers in that old apartment, trapped by the same dark force that haunts the cup. And if you ever find yourself in Seattle, in a small Starbucks on a rainy day, you might just see it, a cup unlike any other, covered in strange, shifting symbols that seem to watch you, waiting for you to take it home. The wind howled through the streets of Chicago that night, sending shivers down the spines of anyone caught outside. But inside the warm walls of the Starbucks on the corner of Halsted and Diversey, it was business as usual. Baristas called out orders. The hum of the espresso machine filled the air. and the smell of freshly ground coffee beans mingled with the faint scent of autumn leaves from the street. Among the staff was Jordan, a diligent young barista known for his friendly demeanor and infectious laugh. He had worked there for over a year and was loved by regulars and co-workers alike. On this particular day, Jordan seemed his usual self, chatty, upbeat, perhaps a bit tired from a late night, but that wasn't unusual for him. The day had been long, and as the clock struck 3 p.m., Jordan decided to take a quick break. "Hey, I'm going to hit the restroom real quick," he called out to Megan, his shift supervisor, who nodded absent-mindedly while taking a customer's order. Jordan slipped through the back, passing the stockroom, and entered the small, dimly lit restroom. He closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing in the quiet space. He splashed some water on his face, looking at himself in the mirror, and smiled at his reflection. The bathroom light flickered slightly. Old wiring, he thought, making a mental note to remind the manager to get it fixed. Minutes passed. Then, an hour. Megan, caught up in the rush, suddenly realized Jordan hadn't returned. "Has anyone seen Jordan?" she asked, glancing around. The other baristas shook their heads. Concerned, Megan made her way to the restroom, knocking gently. "Jordan, you okay in there?" Silence. She knocked again, harder this time. "Jordan?" When there was still no answer, she tried the door, finding it unlocked. She pushed it open slowly, half expecting Jordan to be inside, maybe feeling sick or having just dozed off. But the restroom was empty. The light above flickered again, casting strange shadows on the tiled walls. Confused, Megan checked the stockroom and then the back alley, thinking maybe he stepped out for some air. But there was no sign of him. It was as if Jordan had vanished into thin air. She quickly called the manager, who arrived in minutes, and they decided to review the security footage. Huddled around the small office screen, they watched as the footage played back. There was Jordan, entering the restroom, the door closing behind him. They fast-forwarded. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. No one else entered or left. Jordan never came out. "How is that possible?" Megan whispered, her voice trembling. The manager shook his head, eyes wide with confusion and fear. I don't know." The police were called, and an investigation was launched. They scoured the building, the surrounding area, and even the sewer systems beneath. But there was no trace of Jordan, not a single clue as to where he could have gone. It was as if he had simply disappeared off the face of the earth. Days turned into weeks, and the incident became a chilling mystery whispered about by customers and staff. The Starbucks felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the very air carried a weight of its own. And then the sightings began. At first, it was just a few whispers. Customers claimed they saw Jordan behind the counter, just out of the corner of their eyes. But when they turned to look directly, he wasn't there. His reflection would appear in the coffee machines or in the glass of the pastry display, but if anyone blinked or turned their head, he'd be gone. Some even swore they heard his voice, soft, almost a whisper, calling out orders or saying their names. Megan tried to brush it off as stress or imagination. She had worked there long enough to know the tricks the mind can play, especially in a place where everyone knew everyone. But one night, as she was closing up alone, she heard it. Clear as day. "Megan," a voice called softly from the back. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew that voice. She had heard it 1,000 times. "Jordan?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. There was no response. Just the hum of the espresso machine, the faint hiss of steam. She slowly made her way to the back, her hands trembling as she pushed open the restroom door once more. Empty. The light flickered above, more violently now, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for her. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her, and she fumbled for the light switch. The bulb above burst with a loud pop, showering her with sparks and plunging her into a deeper darkness. "Megan!" The voice came again, closer now, right behind her. She spun around, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps, but she saw nothing. Just shadows in the dark outline of the restroom sink. Her hands found the doorknob and she yanked it open, stumbling back into the light of the store, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't wait to close up properly. She grabbed her things and fled, the echo of Jordan's voice still ringing in her ears. The next morning, the manager found the store unlocked, with lights flickering eerily. He called Megan, but she didn't pick up. She never returned to the store, and rumors spread that she left town, unable to shake the terror of that night. The Starbucks on Halsted and Diversey eventually closed, unable to retain staff or attract customers as the stories grew darker, more twisted. Some said the building was cursed. Others whispered about portals and otherworldly dimensions. But those who had been there knew the truth. Even now, years later, as the building stands abandoned, people say they can still hear Jordan's voice calling out orders in the night. Some brave souls who peek through the dusty windows claim to see a figure moving behind the counter, a barista who never finished his shift, trapped in a loop between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. And every so often, when the wind is just right, and the moon casts its cold light on the deserted storefront, you can still hear the soft, distant sound of Jordan's laughter, echoing down the empty, darkened streets of Chicago.